Hi, and thanks for joining me on yet another interesting and inspiring episode of my marriage podcast, where I talk about issues faced by couples in marriage and I proffer solutions that they can apply in their marriage so that they can have a successful marriage. I'd like to start by saying your marriage will be a success. You shall never experience a broken home. You shall have peace and love in your marriage. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks for downloading this podcast, and please consider subscribing so you get notified of new episode. If you have any question or comment regarding this episode, please send a voice message to anchor.fm/my-marriage-podcast/message. On today's episode, I'll talk to you about should you stay or leave if you discover your spouse is a sex addict. Welcome to my marriage podcast, and I'm your host, Uche Ali. Last week, I came across a story online of a woman who narrated how she discovered her husband is a sex addict. According to her story, they were about losing their home as they had unpaid taxes, which was growing by the day. So she decided to dig further on why they are in so much debt, as she couldn't understand it. So she decided to go through her husband's email to find out why they have so much unpaid debt. While checking to her shock, she found 2 emails of her husband scheduling an appointment with sex workers. This was a painful and devastating revelation. She felt her world was crashing before her. Now, there are several stories like this of women discovering that the husband, which they had once held in high esteem, is nothing but a sex addict. This can be truly devastating and a time of high emotions. But before I dive further into what to do upon discovering, let's first of all find out how to identify a sex addict. First, how do you know if your spouse is a sex addict? Well, as much as I do not encourage monitoring your spouse, but you must be alert and occasionally check through your spouse's email, phone, WhatsApp, social media, in order not to waste away your life living with a sex addict who does not value, respect, nor love you. Now, how do you know if your spouse is a sex addict? What signs or symptoms should you look out for? Well, your spouse is a sex addict if he has compulsive sexual behavior. By this I mean he will seek out for multiple sexual partners, which will include even sleeping with sex workers. He will think of having sex with every other woman apart from you. He will always try to lure girls to bed, always telling jokes that have sexual content or intent. Once he sees a girl or a lady, he starts thinking of how to go to bed with them. He sexualizes every lady. He sees them as a sex object. In fact, he seeks sex as a stress reliever. He masturbates, view pornography, or be in sexual stimulating situations. The way he relates to these women is extremely different from how he relates to you. So another thing for you to look out for is that they are secretive about their behavior and will try to hide it from you, and may lie about their activities or engage in them at times and places where they wouldn't be found out. So simply put, For you to know that your spouse is a sex addict, he has to be addicted to pornography, addicted to prostitutes, addicted to masturbation or fantasy, engage in excessive sexual pursuits. Every girl or lady is a sex object, and he is involved in provocative behavior with the opposite sex. Also, he has chronic obsessive sexual thoughts and fantasies and unable to control his behavior despite knowing the negative consequences of his action and also knowing that this is a life-destroying lifestyle. So these are the signs you need to look out for in your spouse. Once you see 2 or more of these signs, you know that you have a sex addict as a partner. Now, there are different types of sex addicts, but I would like to emphasize on one in particular, and that is called intimacy anorexia sex addict. Now, I'm going to tell you the signs to look out for. Once your spouse exhibits any of these signs, then you know that you have a partner who has intimacy anorexia sex addict. Now, another thing I want you to remember is that a sex addict is as worst as any other addiction. So that is why at the end of this series, I will let you know whether to stay or quit your marriage if you discover that your spouse is a sex addict. So today we are going to discuss about the signs to look out for. Then in the next series, which will be coming up next week, I'm then going to tell you what to do if all these signs shows that your spouse is a sex addict. So going back to the intimacy anorexia sex addict. Now, I'll tell you the signs to check out for. If your spouse exhibits 1 or more of these signs, then I tell you that you have a sex addict as a partner, a sex addict that has intimacy anorexia. Now, one of the signs to look out for is, first of all, if you have ever caught him cheating and, he comes pleading to you and telling you he will never go back to it again, but still he went back to it. This is a sign that you have a partner that has sexual anorexic intimacy. Now, there are still more signs to look out for. So if your partner has about 5 of these signs, then my dear, you have an intimacy anorexia sex addict living with you. Now, the first sign is, does he withhold love from you? And you feel more like a roommate. By this, I mean there is no intimacy in your marriage. Your marriage lacks intimacy. And, both of you just feel like roommates. Then I tell you, my dear, you have a sex addict living with you. Now, does he also withhold praise or appreciation? He hardly ever praises you or appreciates and compliments you. My dear, that is a sign that you have a sex addict living with you. If he hardly ever appreciates whatever you do, he hardly ever gives you compliment, hardly ever appreciates you, that is a red flag. Now, if he hardly communicates with you, he always is by himself, he ignores you, and is controlled by silence or anger, that is another sign to look out for. If he always likes to stay by himself, he hardly communicates with you, you hardly have any meaningful conversation like spouse, then that is another sign to look out for. If he's always silent, he's always angry or showing anger towards you, that is another sign to look out for. Now, if he's always criticizing you and finding fault with you, thereby causing isolation, that is another sign. If he's always criticizing whatever you do, he's always finding fault with it. And because of this criticism, there is you people are isolated from each other. Then this is a sign of someone who is a sex addict. Now, another sign you have to look out for is, does he withhold sex from you? Does he hardly have sex with you? Can you people go for months, even years, without sex? In 6 months, he hasn't touched you. In 3 months, he hasn't touched you. In 1 year, he hasn't touched you. My dear, that is a sign of a sex addict. Or even when he does touch you, it's so mechanical. There is no intimacy. Even when he comes to you and you people are having sex, it's more like sex. It's not love making. There's no emotional connection between both of you. You can notice that there is no love in what he's doing, and it's so obvious he's not enjoying it. It's so mechanical. I tell you, you have a sex addict there with you. Now, if he blames you for everything and hardly takes responsibility for anything at all, he always puts all the blame on you, my dear, be careful. You might have a sex addict there with you. Now, if he's always staying busy, either watching film, being on his phone, going out all day, all in a bid to avoid partner time with you, that might be a sign that he's a sex addict. In fact, if you both hardly have any partner time together where you discuss about yourselves, and he's never involved in your life, he hardly knows what is going on in your life, he doesn't care, I tell you, that is a sign that he is a sex addict. If you people don't have memorable time together, you don't share any quality time together, talking about yourselves, talking about your relationships, he's not deeply involved with you, he doesn't care about what is going on in your life, I tell you that you have a sex addict there with you. Now, if he controls you or shames you with money issues, always talking about the things he does this, he does that, he's the one spending money or taking care of all the finances in the house, if he shames you with money issues, this might be a sex addict there with you. Now, if he is unable to share his feelings, you both don't connect. He can't share his feelings with you, and as a result, you yourself, you can't even share your feelings with him, then you might have a sex addict there with you. If he hardly cares about how you feel, he doesn't care. He doesn't know what is going on in your life. He doesn't know your pains. He doesn't know, he's not even there to give you a shoulder to lean on when you're down. I tell you, your spouse is a sex addict. And now, if he's also withholding spiritual connection with you, you might have a sex addict there with you. Now, if your partner exhibits at least 3 or more of these signs, then your partner is suffering from intimacy, anorexia, sex addict. That means he's not capable of having emotional capacity. He's not capable of opening up to deeper emotions. He lacks emotions. He doesn't know how to have intimacy with his wife. So your relationship would end up looking as if both of you are roommates. There is no connection between both of you. There is no emotional connection between both of you, because he is incapable of sharing his emotions. He's not capable of opening up his heart. So if your spouse or your husband exhibits any of these signs, then he is a sex addict. Now, another thing you must realize is that if someone is a sex addict, there is a deeper issue. There is an underlying issue which has resulted into sex addict. There are other deeper issues in the person's life, perhaps when he was growing up, when he was young. So these are the issues which have not been properly handled that have led that person into becoming a sex addict. And you should always remember that sex addict is also as worst as any other addiction that you can think of. And that is why in our next series, I will tell you what to do if, after listening to this, you have discovered that your spouse is a sex addict. Now, for some who are the sex addict, they might become sex addict because they have suffered abuse, abandonment, trauma, or neglect while growing up. So they are looking for love and acceptances in all the wrong places. And then for others, they might have self-esteem problem. They are depressed, they feel valueless, and so they use sex to self-medicate by trying to use it to elevate their self-image and value through their sexual behavior. And that is why you see that most of them will be sleeping with prostitutes or girls who will perceive them as being highly placed. And this tends to elevate their self-image, their personal value, and perceived worth. So these are some of the reasons that make some people to end up being sex addicts. If they have suffered abuse or abandonment or trauma or neglect while they were growing up, or if they lack self-esteem, they feel they are valueless, they feel they are always depressed, so they are now using sex as a way to self-medicate. So they try to sleep with girls who see them as being highly placed. So that helps them to elevate their self-image. Now, another way or another sign to look out for to know if your spouse is a sex addict is if he is always on his phone or computer and he spends hours online behind closed doors with the excuse that he's working or surfing the internet. My dear, be on guard, because he might be a sex addict feeding himself on pornography and searching for the next lady to lay, or having provocative chats with ladies and having phone sex. So if he's always by himself, he's always on his phone, he's always on his computer at odd hours, he always locks himself up, he doesn't want anybody to be by himself or to see what he's doing on his phone or on his laptop, be on the alert, because you have a sex addict there. He might be there watching pornography and looking for the next lady to lay. Now, another sign you should look out for is if he always complains of being broke and you can't see how the money is being spent. That is a red flag. Just like the story I narrated at the beginning of this episode, where the woman, they were almost going into debt and she was wondering why they were going into debt, and she couldn't understand it until she was going through her husband's email and now find out what the reason could be. So if he's always complaining of being broke and you can't see what exactly he's spending the money on, I tell you, that is a red flag. He might be spending the money on his sex addiction. Then another thing is if he loses interest in sex with you. Like I've said that earlier on, if he doesn't want to have sex with you, or even when he's having the sex with you, you notice he's not emotionally connecting with you, you can't see love in what he's doing, that is a sex addict you have there. And another thing you should look out for, if he can never climax during sex, that is a sign that he's a sex addict. He can no longer have a healthy sex. Conventional sex no longer arouses him, and so you notice he wants to have a defiant sex with you. So if he sleeps with you, and one, there's no emotional connection, two, he can hardly climax each time he sleeps with you, my dear, you have a sex addict there with you because he is no longer used to having a healthy sex. So he prefers having a defiant sex. And another thing is, if he's always requesting, his sexual request is getting freakier, this is a sex addict. Don't mistake it for that you people are trying to try out new things as couples. You need to be alert. If you people have, your preferred styles of having your sex, and all of a sudden you're seeing him, he's telling you, do this style, do this way, he's hitting your bum, all those kind of things that you can see on pornography, then you know that you have a sex addict with you there. Conventional sex is no longer enough for him. It can't arouse him. So he wants something more crazy, something more provocative for him to enjoy the sex. Then you have a sex addict there with you. Another sign you need to look out for is if he has any other addiction, because the truth is that most times a sex addict have other addictions. So what you need to look out for, does he drink heavily? Does he gamble too much? Does he shop compulsively? He can, go on shopping, buy things on compulsion without even thinking about it. Or does he have problem with substance abuse? If your spouse have issues with all this, then you might have a sex addict there with you, because they always have more than one addiction. Now, if your husband has exhibited 3 or more of all these signs that I have given to you, then that means that you are married to a sex addict. Yes, I know that this discovery can be devastating. I know it can make you to have high emotions running through you, but what should you do? Should you leave or stay with him after discovering he's a sex addict? Find out in my next episode next week, when I'll dive further into what to do if your spouse has exhibited any of these signs, which means you are living with a sex addict. Should you leave him? Should you stay with him? Find out in my next episode. Thank you for listening to today's episode of my marriage podcast. Remember to subscribe so that you get notified when a new episode is out. Check out for a new episode every Monday on MooveTv if you are in Nigeria, and on Friday on your favorite podcast app. Remember that you can help this podcast to grow by sharing it, and also by letting others find it when you leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and your favorite podcast app. Please also support my marriage podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/mymarriagepodcast. You can also find my marriage podcast on Google Play, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, Blu-ray, Speaker, Stitcher, Buzzsprout, SoundCloud, YouTube, and any other podcast app. Connect with me on Instagram at mymarriagepodc1 and on email at maritallifeissues@gmail.com. Before I go, I would like to say that the joy stealers will never steal the joy in your home, that the home breakers will never break your home, that your marriage will last forever, and you will keep on finding peace and joy in your home. In Jesus'